Loretta Swit fought a brutal war against her own television show, and her ultimate victory destroyed her future. This is the harsh reality of the woman behind Hot Lips. How MASH changed Loretta Swit forever. In the beginning, the network hired her simply to be a joke, a female target for the male stars to humiliate, but she refused to stay a victim. She battled the writers, demanded respect, and forced them to turn a cheap stereotype into a real human being. But what happens when the exact character you fight to save becomes the only person the industry ever lets you be? The year was 1972. The American television landscape was expanding rapidly, but it remained firmly a boys' club. Loretta Swit was a dedicated, serious actress. She possessed a strong foundation in the theater, trained to look for depth and motivation in her roles. When she was cast in the television adaptation of the hit military comedy MASH, it appeared to be the turning point of a lifetime. It offered a lead role on a major network. It promised financial security and unprecedented visibility. It was everything a working actor could ask for, but the foundation of the role was already compromised from the start. The television series was heavily based on the successful 1970 feature film. In that original blueprint, the character of the head nurse was explicitly written as a strict, hypocritical military woman. Her primary function in the narrative was to be sexually teased and constantly undermined by the male protagonists. Her notorious nickname, Hot Lips, was inherently demeaning. It was originally born from a clandestine microphone broadcasting her most private, intimate moments to an entire military camp. It was a severe violation of privacy, played entirely for uproarious comedy. Behind the scenes, the production environment closely mirrored what was happening on the screen. The writer's room was almost exclusively male. The core cast was heavily male-dominated. For much of the show's early run, Swit was the absolute sole female regular in the entire ensemble. She was completely surrounded by men who were making the decisions about how a woman should react to being mocked by men. The initial excitement of landing a career-defining role was soon shadowed. A quiet, pervasive unease began to set in. Swit was stepping onto a massive, highly anticipated production set. Yet she quickly realized it was a space not originally designed to respect her as an equal artist. The early scripts demanded she play the fool. The environment demanded she be a good sport about it. When you are the sole woman in the room, surrounded by an impenetrable wall of male authority, a difficult reality begins to dawn. You are forced to wonder if a major career breakthrough is truly a golden opportunity, or if it is merely a highly visible, well-paying trap. The psychological toll of those early production years was rooted in the unforgiving reality of the daily shooting schedule. It was not merely a matter of showing up and reciting lines. For Loretta Swit, the daily commute to the studio meant preparing to inhabit a space of active, scripted degradation. The early call times required her to step into the rigid military uniform of Major Margaret Houlihan, but the armor offered no actual protection. The scripts waiting for her in the dressing room were consistent in their demands. They required her to act as the designated target for the show's comedic engine. In the television industry of 1972, the mechanics of sitcom writing relied heavily on a clear, established hierarchy of power. The writers needed a foil for the anti-establishment doctors, Captains Hawkeye Pierce and Trapper John McIntyre. Major Houlihan was constructed precisely for this purpose, but she was not simply a rigid rule follower to be outsmarted. She was a woman to be humiliated. The distinction is crucial. When the male characters clashed with male superiors, the comedy stemmed from a battle of wits or a subversion of military protocol. When they clashed with Margaret, the comedy almost invariably defaulted to her gender and her sexuality. She was required to endure a relentless barrage of sexual teasing. The scripts frequently positioned her in states of forced vulnerability. She was the woman whose private life was treated as public entertainment by the men around her. The audience was instructed to laugh at her outrage. They were told that her anger at being objectified was merely the hysterical overreaction of a woman who took herself too seriously. Swit had to memorize these scenes. She had to rehearse them under the harsh studio lights. She had to perform them repeatedly from multiple camera angles until the director was satisfied with the comedic timing of her humiliation. The recurring motif of the shower tent perfectly illustrated this dynamic. In the early seasons, the violation of Margaret's physical privacy was presented as a reliable punchline. The setups were variations on a single, cruel theme, exposing the strict female officer to the gaze of the entire camp. Swit did not just read these scenes on a page. She had to physically enact them. She had to stand on a sound stage, surrounded by a largely male camera crew, male lighting technicians, a male director, and her male co-stars. She had to feign the shock, the panic, and the profound indignity of having her privacy violently breached. Then she had to listen to the crew laugh. Later, the canned laughter of the studio audience would be laid over the track, cementing the incident as harmless fun. This required a brutal form of psychological compartmentalization. Swit was a serious stage-trained actor. She understood the mechanics of a joke, but she was also trained to find the emotional truth of a moment. The emotional truth of being publicly exposed and mocked is not funny, it is traumatizing, yet the environment demanded that she play the trauma as farce. She had to suppress her own artistic instincts and her nature, our human reactions, to serve a narrative that fundamentally disrespected her character. This dynamic created a profound, crushing sense of dual isolation. On the screen, Margaret Houlihan was completely alone. She was stationed in a war zone, surrounded by men who despised her authority and viewed her as a walking target. She had no friends, no female confidants, and no safe space within the fictional camp of the 4077th. Off the screen, the structural reality mirrored this isolation. Swit was the sole female regular in an overwhelmingly male ensemble. While actors like Alan Alda would eventually become vocal champions for women's rights and help evolve her character, the initial production culture of 1970s television was an impenetrable boys' club. The male leads possessed the effortless camaraderie of men who inherently dominated their environment. They could improvise and play the objectification of Margaret as a light-hearted gag, confident that at the end of the day, they returned to a world that respected their autonomy. Swit possessed no such luxury. When the director called cut, there was no other woman in the main cast to exchange a knowing glance with, and no female producer to confide in. There was only a writer's room filled with men delivering the next script where she would once again serve as the punchline. The structural power imbalance was absolute. The male characters were celebrated as anti-war heroes, rebelling against a senseless military machine. Yet, the early scripts inherently positioned them in a place of unquestioned male dominance. The audience was conditioned to view their targeted pranks against Margaret not as cruelty, but as justified rebellion against a rigid woman who dared to hold authority over men. Enduring this environment required the adoption of a specific, exhausting persona, the good sport. In the Hollywood culture of the 1970s, a woman complaining about being sexually objectified on a comedy set risked professional suicide. If she objected too forcefully to a script, she would be branded difficult. If she showed genuine distress over a humiliating scene, she would be dismissed as too sensitive or accused of lacking a sense of humor. To survive, Swit had to project an aura of unshakable professionalism. She had to hit her marks, deliver the lines with precise comedic timing, and smile when the camera stopped rolling. This mandatory, cheerful facade was perhaps the most draining performance she delivered. It served as a protective mask, worn specifically to reassure the male crew that she posed no threat to their established culture. Maintaining this polite, cheerful facade was her method of surviving a hostile work environment. She compromised just enough to remain employed on a set that actively worked to diminish her character. She had to participate willingly in the erosion of her character's dignity. Every time she played the hysterical victim of a prank, she reinforced the very stereotype she despised. She was required to use her considerable talent to make her own degradation entertaining. The sheer physical and emotional energy required to sustain this balancing act was immense. She had to build an impenetrable wall between her own values and the demands of her employer. The fatigue of this existence was not sudden. It was a slow, grinding attrition. It was the daily accumulation of small indignities. It was the exhaustion of constantly defending a rigid posture on screen while feeling completely unsupported off it. She was trapped in a highly successful machine, earning a substantial living and appearing in front of millions of viewers every week. Yet, the core of her daily work consisted of simulating her own humiliation for the amusement of a world that refused to see the cruelty of the joke. The golden opportunity had quickly solidified into a daily endurance test. The price of being the only woman in the room was the daily requirement to surrender her dignity on cue. The breaking point in any oppressive environment rarely arrives with a cinematic explosion. More often, it is a quiet, internal fracture. For Loretta Swit, navigating the grueling production schedule of her second and third years on the set, the realization did not manifest as a loud confrontation in the executive offices. It crystallized as a cold, strategic necessity. She looked at the trajectory of her daily humiliations and understood a fundamental truth of the television industry. The system was functioning exactly as it was designed to. The writers were not going to suddenly awaken to the misogyny of their own scripts. The directors were not going to voluntarily sacrifice a cheap laugh for the sake of a female character's dignity. If Major Margaret Houlihan was going to survive as a human being, Swit had to seize control from the inside. This marked the beginning of a silent, protracted war of attrition. The battleground was not a boardroom. It was the soundstage. Swit's weapon of choice was not a list of formal demands, but the deeply ingrained tools of her own acting methodology. She operated under a singular, unbreakable internal directive. I wasn't going to let her be a joke. This rebellion relied on a highly specific psychological technique, a television actor fundamentally subverting a script without changing a single word of the dialogue. Swit began to employ a technique known as playing against the text. When a script called for Margaret to be the hysterical victim of a prank orchestrated by Hawkeye or Trapper, the stage directions dictated a comedic overreaction. The intended result was farce. Swit, however, made a conscious radical choice. She stopped playing the farce and started playing the emotional reality of the scene. If the script required her private quarters to be invaded, she did not react with the cartoonish, shrieking indignation that the writers envisioned. Instead, she played the genuine, terrifying vulnerability of a woman whose sanctuary, H, had been violated. She allowed real hurt to flash across her face. She grounded her anger in actual professional outrage rather than comedic hysteria. By anchoring her performance in absolute, unvarnished realism, she effectively sabotaged the joke. A studio audience cannot easily laugh at a woman who looks genuinely traumatized. A director cannot easily lay canned laughter over a performance that radiates legitimate pain. Swit was deliberately breaking the comedic machinery of the show. She was forcing the men behind the cameras to look at the cruelty they had written. It was a master class in passive resistance. She never refused to do a scene, which would have gotten her labeled as uncooperative or fired. She simply performed the scenes with a level of psychological truth that made the underlying misogyny glaringly uncomfortable for everyone in the room. This rebellion extended far beyond individual scenes. Swit launched a systematic campaign against the fundamental rule of 1970s sitcom structure, the emotional reset. In traditional television comedies of that era, characters existed in a state of suspended animation. Whatever trauma, humiliation, or revelation occurred in episode 4 was completely erased by the beginning of episode 5. The status quo had to be maintained. Swit flatly refused to participate in this erasure. She began to enforce a strict emotional continuity for Margaret Houlihan. If Margaret was publicly humiliated by the male doctors, Swit carried that lingering resentment and guardedness into the next week's filming, even if the new script did not explicitly call for it. She built a psychological ledger for the character. Every insult, every dismissal, every moment of isolation was cataloged and incorporated into her physical posture, the tightness of her jaw and the coldness in her eyes. By refusing to let Margaret forget the indignity she suffered, Swit forced the audience and ultimately the writers to acknowledge the cumulative weight of the abuse. The writers' room, accustomed to dictating reality from the safety of their typewriters, suddenly found themselves confronted with a living, breathing blockade. They could not write Margaret as a two-dimensional caricature if the actress inhabiting her stubbornly radiated three-dimensional trauma. The character was outgrowing the narrow, degrading box they had built for her, and Swit was the architect of that expansion. But breaking the old machinery was only the first half of her strategy. She also had to build something new in its place. Swit shifted from passive resistance to active negotiation. She began engaging with the producers and writers, not with complaints, but with compelling narrative alternatives. She recognized that to strip away the hot lips caricature permanently, Margaret needed a life, a history, and an intellect that existed independently of the men who mocked her. She pushed aggressively for storylines that highlighted Margaret's absolute competence as a head nurse. Swit wanted the audience to see that while the drafted doctors treated the war like an inconvenience, Margaret treated the triage unit with the utmost reverence. She was a career military woman who took the saving of lives with grim seriousness. Swit demanded scenes where Margaret's medical expertise was undeniable, where her strict discipline was the very thing that kept the chaotic hospital functioning during the mass casualty events. She transformed the character's rigidity from a comedic flaw into a vital survival mechanism in a war zone. Furthermore, Swit advocated for Margaret to experience genuine heartbreak. She championed the storyline involving Margaret's engagement and subsequent marriage to Lieutenant Colonel Donald Penobscot. On the surface, it seemed like a standard romantic arc. In Swit's hands, it was a strategic maneuver to explore Margaret's profound loneliness and her desperate desire for validation. When the marriage inevitably crumbled, revealing Penobscot, its infidelity and arrogance, Swit did not play it for laughs. She played the devastating humiliation of a fiercely proud woman whose dreams of a perfect military partnership had turned to ash. By executing this sharp emotional pivot, she actively forced the camera to linger on her face long after the anticipated punchline. The directors suddenly found themselves capturing raw, unscripted grief rather than the comfortable situational comedy they expected. She effectively hijacked the visual language of the series from within the frame. She made it structurally impossible for the editing room to cut around Margaret's humanity, forcing the network to broadcast her pain. Through these choices, Swit forced a monumental shift in the balance of power. She cornered the writers. They realized that writing cheap, objectifying jokes for Margaret no longer worked because the actress would no longer sell them. Conversely, writing dramatic, complex material for Margaret yielded incredible award-worthy television because Swit was a powerhouse of dramatic talent. The writers slowly, inevitably surrendered to her vision. They began writing for the woman Swit had created rather than the caricature they had originally conceived. They started giving Margaret monologues about her insecurities, her isolation, and the immense pressure of commanding respect in a camp governed by men who despised her. Swit had not just survived the writer's room, she had successfully re-educated it. This was not a victory achieved through loud activism or public crusades. It was a triumph of pure, relentless craftsmanship. She used the script as a battlefield and her talent as leverage. Every subtle shift in her voice, every refusal to play the fool, every moment of unscripted dignity was a calculated strike against a system designed to diminish her. Loretta Swit executed a quiet, bloodless coup on one of the most watched television sets in history, wresting the soul of her character away from the men who invented her. She saved Margaret Houlihan, one compromise script at a time. The transformation was neither sudden nor officially announced. It occurred through a gradual, undeniable tectonic shift in the cultural landscape of the television show. By the middle seasons, a profound silence had fallen over the cruelest elements of the script. The notorious nickname, the two syllables that had defined her degradation, began to quietly evaporate from the dialogue. The writers did not issue a memo declaring the death of the caricature. They simply stopped using the weapon because the actress had rendered it obsolete. The woman the public had been conditioned to view as a walking punchline had methodically erased her own punchline. In its place stood Major Margaret Houlihan, a fully realized three-dimensional human being. This was an unprecedented victory in the realm of television production. The character who emerged from this crucible was a revelation. Margaret Houlihan evolved into the undeniable moral and operational backbone of the fictional hospital camp. The scripts now reflected the reality Loretta Swit had been forcing onto the screen for years. She was portrayed as an elite, exhausted professional holding a chaotic, bleeding unit together through sheer force of will and an unyielding commitment to military discipline. The audience watched as her rigid exterior fractured, not for cheap comedic effect, but to reveal the profound exhaustion, the deep-seated loneliness, and the fierce intelligence of a woman commanding a war zone. The industry was forced to acknowledge the magnitude of this artistic triumph. The Television Academy, the ultimate arbiter of professional validation in Hollywood, awarded Swit with 2 Emmy Awards for Outstanding Supporting Actress in a comedy or variety or music series. These awards were not mere trophies. They were the physical manifestation of her quiet rebellion. They represented the establishment bowing to the sheer undeniable force of her craftsmanship. When Swit held those statuettes, she was holding the ultimate proof that her strategy had worked. She had stared down a male-dominated writer's room. She had rejected the mandate to play the fool, and she had forced an entire nation to respect a character they had initially been instructed to mock. She had won the war over Margaret Houlihan's soul. Holding those golden statuettes provided a tangible, undeniable vindication of her prolonged, silent mutiny. It proved directly to the network executives that audiences craved complex, deeply flawed women rather than easily digestible caricatures. Yet behind the polite applause of the Hollywood establishment, she clearly recognized the dangerous precedent she was setting for her own life. She had made herself incredibly valuable to the network by perfecting a specific persona that she desperately needed to shed. Yet, at the absolute zenith of this triumph, a darker, far more permanent reality began to set in. The victory on the screen was absolute, but the war for her own artistic identity was taking a devastating turn. The mechanism of this new trap was insidious precisely because it was built from the materials of her own success. To humanize Margaret, Swit had to pour her entire artistic arsenal into the role. She had to make the character's pain, her authority, and her specific mannerisms terrifyingly. She succeeded so completely that the American public, and crucially the Hollywood executives, lost the ability to separate the actress from the creation. This is the brutal paradox of the typecasting machine, particularly as it applies to women in the entertainment industry. When a male actor delivers a commanding, transformative performance on a hit television show, the industry views it as a demonstration of range. He is subsequently offered diverse leading roles, his talent viewed as a versatile tool. But when Loretta Swit delivered a fiercely intelligent, uncompromising performance of a strict military woman, the industry did not see range. They saw a permanent state of being. The executives watching her Emmy-winning performances did not say, "Look at what a brilliant actress she is." They said, "Look at how perfectly she is Margaret Houlihan." Her victory in humanizing the character had a devastating unintended consequence. It cemented the character's traits directly onto Swit's own public persona. The more depth she gave to Margaret, the tighter the parameters of her own career became. The industry began to view her not as an artist who was acting, but as a woman who simply existed in this one specific, rigid form. They assumed the authority, the sharpness, and the military bearing were not choices made by a skilled performer, but the innate, unalterable characteristics of Loretta Swit herself. This conflation of actor and character began to bleed into her daily life and her professional prospects outside the confines of the television set. The public recognition she received was immense, but it was suffocatingly narrow. Fans approaching her on the street did not greet Loretta Swit. They saluted Major Houlihan. Interviewers did not ask about her acting methodology or her theatrical background. They asked about military protocol and the fictional doctors of the 4077th. The name she had fought to legitimize on screen was systematically erasing her actual name in the real world. Journalists routinely addressed her by her military rank during promotional tours, comfortably blurring the crucial line between the actor and the network asset. When she attempted to guide these conversations toward her acting methodology, the question stubbornly circled back to the fictional camp. Her own biography was being aggressively rewritten in real time. It was being overwritten by the fictional history she had fought so fiercely to construct for a phantom. She had poured her blood and sweat into proving she was a serious, capable actress. Yet in a stroke of crushing irony, that exact proof became her prison. By convincing the world that she was the perfect, uncompromising Margaret Houlihan, she inadvertently convinced the industry that she could never be anyone else. The casting directors of Hollywood looked at her and saw only the olive drab uniform and brass insignia. She had won the battle for respect within the boundaries of the television show, but the walls of the fictional military camp were expanding outward, building an impenetrable cage around her entire future. She was the victor of the on-screen war, but she was slowly becoming a prisoner of her own success, permanently trapped in the golden monument she had spent a decade building. On the 28th of February, 1983, the television series concluded its historic 11-year run. The final episode was an unprecedented cultural event, watched by over 100 million people. It remains one of the most viewed television broadcasts in human history. When the cameras finally stopped rolling and the sets of the 4077th were permanently dismantled, Loretta Swit unlaced her combat boots for the last time. She removed the dog tags. She took off the olive drab uniform that had defined her daily existence for over a decade. Walking off the 20th Century Fox lot, she carried the assumption that naturally follows a triumph of such staggering magnitude. She possessed 2 Emmy Awards. She possessed universal name recognition. She possessed a proven, undeniable track record of transforming weak material into television gold. The logical expectation was that the gates of Hollywood would swing wide open. She anticipated a return to her roots as a versatile character actress, ready to inhabit new lives, explore new psychologies, and leave the military base far behind her. She believed she had finally earned her artistic freedom. But freedom in the entertainment industry is a highly conditional illusion. The reality waiting for her outside the studio gates was not a landscape of open opportunity. It was an invisible, impenetrable fortress built entirely from her own success. When Loretta Swit began taking meetings for new film and television projects, she encountered a bizarre and terrifying phenomenon. The casting directors, the network executives, and the producers did not look across the table and see an extraordinarily capable, award-winning actress. They looked across the table and saw an imposter. They saw Major Margaret Houlihan attempting to wear civilian clothes. The brutal mechanics of this trap were forged by the specific consuming nature of television fame, particularly in the era before the fragmentation of media. Television is not like cinema. A film actor visits the audience in the dark for 2 hours and then disappears. A television actor in a hit sitcom of the 1970s and 1980s was an intimate weekly guest in the living rooms of the American public. For 11 years, the public had not just watched Margaret Houlihan, they had lived alongside her. They had internalized her vocal cadences, her rigid posture, and her specific brand of authoritative vulnerability. This extreme overexposure created a profound psychological bond between the audience and the character, but it completely severed the audience's ability to see the actor behind the mask. The character had grown so massive, so culturally monolithic, that it simply swallowed the artist whole. When Swit stepped into audition rooms, the executives experienced severe cognitive dissonance. If she attempted to read for a role that was soft, maternal, or submissive, the producers could not process the performance. Their brains were hardwired to expect the sharp bark of a military commander. If she smiled warmly, it felt unnatural to them, simply because they had spent a decade watching her smile only as a rare, hard-won concession on a war-torn soundstage. They refused to suspend their disbelief. The industry did not want to hire Loretta Swit to act. They wanted to hire Margaret Houlihan to exist in other settings. The scripts that did arrive at her door were not opportunities. They were insults disguised as employment. She was inundated with offers to play variations of the exact same woman. They wanted her to play strict school headmistresses, rigid corporate executives, and overbearing matriarchs. They offered her characters whose sole narrative purpose was to walk into a room, assert aggressive authority, and serve as an obstacle for the main characters. They were asking her to regress. They were asking her to step backward in time and inhabit the two-dimensional caricatures she had spent the last 11 years fighting to destroy. She had just won a grueling decade-long war to prove that a strict woman was not a punchline, and the industry's immediate response was to ask her to play the punchline again. These incoming scripts were not merely unimaginative, they were deeply professionally offensive. They demanded no nuance, offered no emotional arcs, and required no underlying intelligence from the performer. The executives were essentially offering to pay her handsomely to dismantle a decade of hard-won progress. They gambled on the assumption that she would happily trade her hard-fought artistic integrity for the security of a steady, highly visible paycheck. This is the specific, insidious cruelty of typecasting for women in Hollywood. It is a mechanism of containment. When a woman demonstrates formidable strength, unyielding authority, and complex independence on screen, the industry rarely knows how to replicate that success in different genres. Instead, they freeze the actress in time. They decide that she is not a skilled artisan, capable of building many different houses. They decide she is the house itself. Every subsequent role offered to her was essentially a demand that she perform a cover version of her own greatest hit. Swit found herself caught in an agonizing professional purgatory. If she accepted these derivative roles, yes, he would be actively participating in the destruction of her own artistic range. She would be voluntarily putting herself back into the box she had just escaped. But if she refused them, she risked total invisibility in the primary mediums of film and television. The industry was sending a clear, uncompromising message. You will play this specific type of woman, or you will not play at all. Her identity as an artist was being systematically erased and replaced by a piece of intellectual property owned by a television network. Driven by a desperate need to act, to stretch her muscles, and to prove her versatility, Swit retreated to the one arena that has historically respected the craft of acting over the commodification of personality, the theater. Away from the harsh glare of Los Angeles, she sought refuge on the stage. She took on the demanding one-woman show Shirley Valentine, stepping into the shoes of an ordinary working-class British housewife who escapes to Greece to find herself. She took on the flamboyant, larger-than-life title role in the musical Mame. She threw herself into plays like The Mystery of Edwin Drood and Love Letters. In the theater, surrounded by audiences who understood the fundamental contract of performance, she could breathe. The stage allowed her to shed the uniform. It allowed her to manipulate her voice, alter her physicality, and completely vanish into characters that bore absolutely no resemblance to a military nurse. She received standing ovations. She proved night after night to anyone willing to buy a ticket that her talent was vast, pliable, and entirely independent of the television show that made her famous. But the victory of the stage is inherently localized. It does not possess the sweeping cultural megaphone of a major motion picture or a primetime television network. While she was receiving critical acclaim in regional theaters and national tours, the executives in Los Angeles remained entirely unmoved. In the eyes of the mainstream entertainment industrial complex, her theatrical triumphs were irrelevant. They viewed her stage work not as proof of her versatility, but as a temporary hobby of a television star whose prime had passed. The theater accepted her, but television and film had permanently exiled her. This exile was not born of malice, which makes it all the more tragic. It was born of a profound structural lack of imagination. The people holding the levers of power in Hollywood simply could not reconcile the woman they saw on stage with the icon they had monetized for over a decade. They had made hundreds of millions of dollars off the image of Major Houlihan, and they fiercely protected their mental real estate. They punished Loretta Swit for being too convincing. They punished her for being too good at her job. The psychological weight of this realization was staggering. She had dedicated her youth to perfecting her craft, surviving a hostile environment by outworking and outacting everyone around her. She had achieved the pinnacle of success, won the highest awards, and fundamentally changed how women were portrayed on screen. Yet, her reward for this monumental achievement was permanent professional confinement. This is the ultimate devastating paradox of her career. If Loretta Swit had been a mediocre actress, she might have escaped. If she had simply read the lines exactly as they were written in 1972, if she had allowed Margaret Houlihan to remain a screaming one-dimensional cartoon, the public would not have cared about the character. The show would have ended, the character would have been forgotten, and Swit could have quietly moved on to other projects. But she refused to be mediocre. She refused to let the character be a joke. She poured her intellect, her empathy, and her formidable talent into the role. She demanded that the character be granted a soul. She succeeded so brilliantly that she made the character immortal. And in making the character immortal, she surrendered her own future. She spent years meticulously developing the character into a television icon, only to realize that the industry would never allow her to step outside of it. She had won the role of a lifetime, but she had lost the right to be Loretta Swit. Faced with an industry that relentlessly demanded she repeat her past, Loretta Swit executed a maneuver that Hollywood rarely anticipates and almost never understands. She simply stopped playing the game. When an actor finds themselves permanently walled into a single iconic persona by the heavy machinery of typecasting, the conventional response is one of desperate, visible struggle. The established narrative arc for an aging television star demands a public fight for relevance. The industry expects the actor to beg for complex roles, to reinvent their image through scandalous publicity, or to dramatically crash under the psychological weight of their faded visibility. Swit rejected all of these expected paths. Instead, she chose a profound, strategic, and highly dignified retreat. She did not lose the battle for her post-television career. She actively chose to abandon the battlefield. The absolute power of this decision becomes glaringly clear when viewed against the intense, almost radioactive nature of celebrity in the mid-1980s. When the television cameras finally went dark, the tabloid cameras immediately intensified their focus. The press possessed a ravenous appetite for the private failures of public figures. They actively hunted for narratives of tragedy, particularly concerning women who had dared to be powerful on screen. If Swit had engaged in a messy public war against her typecasting, the media would have weaponized her frustration. They would have painted her as a bitter, fading star, desperately clinging to the fading embers of a bygone decade. By choosing silence, she completely starved the tabloid machinery of its fuel. She erected an impenetrable fortress around her personal life, enforcing a boundary between her public image and her private reality that few modern celebrities have ever successfully maintained. This strict enforcement of privacy was most evident in her personal relationships. In 1983, the exact same year her monumental television series concluded, she married the actor Dennis Holohan. It was a union that began quietly and existed far away from the glaring flashbulbs of Hollywood premieres. For an actress who had spent 11 years playing a woman constantly defined, pursued, and harassed by the men around her, this marriage represented a distinct reclamation of personal normalcy. However, life rarely adheres to the neat resolving arcs of a scripted drama. 12 years later, in 1995, the marriage ended in divorce. In the ecosystem of celebrity culture, a divorce is typically a highly commodified event. It is usually accompanied by leaked rumors, warring publicists, and sensationalized interviews detailing the collapse of the relationship. Swit offered the public none of this. The dissolution of her marriage was handled with the exact same guarded stoicism that had come to define her off-screen existence. She issued no public postmortems. She did not leverage her personal heartbreak for public sympathy. She recognized that offering her pain to the press would simply invite the world back in to consume her identity. She chose to process her loss in absolute privacy, treating her own emotional life as a sacred space that the public had absolutely no right to access. This fierce protection of her private world also extended to her choice not to have children. In the cultural climate of the late 20th century, an unmarried or divorced woman without children was frequently subjected to intense societal scrutiny and unsolicited psychological analysis. The press often framed childless women as either tragic victims of circumstance or cold, career-obsessed figures. Swit navigated this intense societal pressure through complete, unwavering non-engagement. She did not offer defensive explanations. She did not publish memoirs detailing the private reasoning behind her life choices. She simply lived her life refusing to validate the invasive questions of a culture that felt entitled to the biological details of a famous woman. In doing so, she silently asserted that a woman's worth and her legacy are not strictly defined by traditional familial structures. As she deliberately stepped back from the relentless pursuit of on-screen roles, she did not simply fade into idleness. The formidable, unyielding energy that she had previously channeled into fighting writers' rooms and shaping television scripts required a new outlet. She found it in a cause that offered a stark, profound contrast to the artificiality of the entertainment business. She became a fiercely dedicated, deeply involved advocate for animal rights. This pivot to activism was not the superficial, image-enhancing philanthropy often adopted by celebrities seeking positive public relations. It was a grueling, hands-on commitment. She founded the Sweetheart Animal Alliance, dedicating her time, her resources, and her fiercely protected name to the rescue and defense of vulnerable animals. The psychological depth of this transition perfectly mirrored the thematic arc of her entire life. For over a decade, she had engaged in a bruising daily war to give a voice to a fictional woman who had been written as a two-dimensional object. She had fought to secure dignity for a character who possessed none. When Hollywood refused to let her speak for anyone else, she transferred that exact same protective fury to creatures that were literally incapable of speaking for themselves. Within the boundaries of the animal sanctuaries, there were no toxic power imbalances to navigate and no fragile male egos to soothe. She found a profound restorative release in dedicating her energy to physical, tangible acts of salvation that required no audience and no cameras. In this space, her inherent sternness transformed into a tool for fierce advocacy. It was entirely stripped of the demeaning comedic baggage the television industry had strapped to it. The contrast between her former career and her chosen activism is deeply poetic. In Hollywood, she was surrounded by people who spoke constantly but said very little of substance. The industry was built on deception, manufactured emotions, and the relentless commodification of human beings. In the realm of animal rescue, the stakes were viscerally real. There were no scripts to rewrite, no egos to manage, and no executives demanding that she soften her approach. There was only pure, unvarnished vulnerability meeting uncompromising compassion. She traded the hollow applause of the studio audience for the quiet, profound reality of saving lives. It was an environment where her fierce determination and her refusal to compromise were actually valued as virtues, rather than being dismissed as the difficult traits of an aging actress. Many cultural observers and historians of the entertainment industry point out that this phase of her life represents a masterclass in the reclamation of personal agency. The Hollywood system operates on the fundamental premise that the actor desperately needs the industry's validation to exist. The entire power dynamic is structured around the actor asking for permission to audition, permission to work, permission to be seen. When casting directors only offered her derivative, humiliating echoes of her past triumphs, they were exercising their power to reject her. By walking away, Swit effectively turned the mechanism of rejection upside down. She fired the industry before it could fully fire her. She stripped the executives of their leverage. They could not threaten to end the career of a woman who had already decided her career was no longer the center of her universe. This is the profound, quiet victory of her retreat. It was not a defy. Masked by isolation. It was a preemptive strike against an industry that intended to slowly, publicly humiliate her through a series of diminishing returns. She chose to exist entirely on her own terms, even if those terms required her to vanish from the cultural center stage. The woman who emerged in these later decades was a study in absolute contrast. On television screens around the world, running in endless, eternal syndication, she remained the loud, rigid, aggressive military officer. Millions of people continued to watch her bark orders, demand respect, and fight for her space in a chaotic, fictional war zone. Yet the real woman who had breathed life into that ghost was living a quiet, purposeful life far removed from the noise. She was walking dogs. She was funding sanctuaries. She was painting. She was existing in a state of carefully curated peace. This duality highlights the ultimate tragedy and the ultimate triumph of her specific trajectory. The public was permanently denied the opportunity to witness the full, expansive range of her artistic capabilities. The world was robbed of the countless complex women she could have portrayed if the industry had possessed the imagination to let her work. That is the tragedy. But the triumph is that she did not allow that denial to destroy her soul. She did not become the tragic alcoholic casualty of fame that the tabloids so desperately wanted her to be. She did not sacrifice her dignity in a futile attempt to force an immovable door to open. Loretta Swit recognized that the ultimate form of power is the ability to walk away from a rigged game. She chose a life of active, meaningful solitude over a life of highly visible compromise. She took the formidable strength she had built on the sound stages of her youth and used it to fortify the walls of her own private sanctuary. In a culture that equates silence with irrelevance and retreat with surrender, she proved that true agency sometimes looks like a closed door. She became the author of her own silence, ensuring that the final chapters of her life were written not by television executives or tabloid journalists, but entirely by herself. When an actor reaches the twilight of their life, retrospective interviews often take on a polished, nostalgic gloss. The harsh edges of old conflicts are typically sanded down by time. The narrative is usually smoothed over to present a comforting story of universal triumph. Loretta Swit, however, offered something far more complex and challenging. In the rare, candid interviews conducted in her later years, she did not simply bask in the warm glow of classic television syndication. She engaged in a rigorous, unflinching autopsy of her defining role. She looked back at Major Margaret Houlihan, not merely as a career highlight, but as a lifelong psychological companion. This period of reflection was marked by a profound, inescapable duality. It was a delicate, tightly woven tapestry of immense professional pride and a sober, quiet acknowledgement of the devastating personal cost. The anchor of her retrospective thoughts frequently returned to that pivotal internal shift she made in the early 1970s. During one particularly revealing conversation, she crystallized her entire survival strategy into a single defining statement. She noted that around the second or third year, she decided to try to play the character as a real person in an intelligent fashion, even if it meant hurting the jokes. This sentence requires careful, deliberate dissection. On the surface, it sounds like a standard, commendable choice made by a dedicated actor. Beneath the surface, it is a confession of deliberate, calculated sabotage against the original premise of the show. She openly admitted to prioritizing the humanity of her character over the comedic mandate of her employers. She acknowledged that the original jokes were designed to function only if she remained a two-dimensional object of ridicule. By choosing elegance, she intentionally broke the comedic machinery of the writer's room. In her later years, she spoke of this quiet sabotage not with any sense of apology, but with a cold, steely pride. She recognized that destroying the cheap laughs was the only way to save the woman she was playing. She looked back at those early scripts and knew that if she had simply followed orders, her character would have remained a victim. Her pride was rooted in the knowledge that she had successfully staged a bloodless coup on a major television set. Yet this pride was never unalloyed. For decades, she had maintained a stoic, impenetrable front. She had consistently refused to publicly complain about the suffocating nature of her fame. She never wanted to appear ungrateful to the public. But as time created a vast distance between her and the sound stages of her youth, the heavy armor she wore softened just enough to reveal the profound exhaustion beneath. She began to articulate the specific grinding weight of the burden she had carried for 11 years. To humanize Margaret, she had to engage in a daily, relentless negotiation with a system that inherently resisted her. She had to constantly police the incoming scripts. She had to remain ever vigilant against the creeping return of the old misogynistic tropes that the writers naturally defaulted to. In hindsight, she recognized the immense invisible toll of this permanent vigilance. She admitted that functioning as the sole protector of her character's dignity in a male-dominated ecosystem had drained her in ways she could not fully process while she was in the trenches. She had fought a continuous defensive war, and even the victors of such prolonged conflicts bear permanent psychological scars. She could finally admit that being strong all the time was a deeply tiring existence. The complexity of her reflection deepened significantly when she discussed the enduring global legacy of the character. She knew that millions of people around the world genuinely loved Margaret Houlihan. She deeply respected that affection. She frequently expressed sincere gratitude for the fans who approached her on the street. She recognized that their love was directed at the strong, capable, independent woman she had fought so fiercely to construct. She did not resent the audience for their devotion. However, in her quietest moments of reflection, she acknowledged the bitter, inescapable ironies of this global adoration. The public loved the character she had built, but their love functioned as the very padlock on her professional cage. She had to reconcile the agonizing fact that her greatest gift to the television viewing public was simultaneously the instrument of her own artistic imprisonment. The audience's refusal to let the character go was the exact mechanism that prevented her from moving forward. This reconciliation required a sophisticated psychological balancing act that few people are ever forced to perform. She could not entirely disown the character. To reject Margaret would be to disown her own hard-won victory over the writer's room. Margaret was her masterpiece, a testament to her skill and her endurance. But she also could not fully embrace the character without validating the industry's stubborn refusal to let her be anything else. Her late interviews capture a woman standing perfectly still on this extremely narrow tightrope. She spoke of the role with a fiercely protective tone. She defended Margaret's complexities, her flaws, and her military rigidity to the very end, exactly as a mother defends a misunderstood child. Yet she also spoke with the serene, detached clarity of a woman who had long ago accepted that the industry had extracted a brutal tax for her success. She understood the transaction with absolute, unforgiving clarity. She had purchased the soul of her character, and the non-negotiable price she paid was the entire future trajectory of her own career. When analyzing her reflections on her male co-stars, the depth of her understanding of systemic inequality becomes strikingly clear. She watched the men she had worked alongside for a decade transition out of the show and into diverse, celebrated careers. They were allowed to be directors, writers, and versatile leading men. They were granted the privilege of evolution. She was granted only the privilege of syndication. In her later years, she did not express petty jealousy over their opportunities. Instead, she viewed the disparity with a sharp, analytical eye. She recognized that the industry's imagination simply failed when it came to strong women. She made peace with the knowledge that she possessed the exact same talent and drive as her male counterparts, but was operating under a completely different set of structural rules. Making peace with this double standard, without allowing it to turn into corrosive bitterness, was perhaps her greatest off-screen achievement. Ultimately, her reflections revealed a woman who had achieved a rare state of grace without ever resorting to delusion. She did not pretend that the Hollywood system was fair or meritocratic. She did not romanticize the severe limitations placed upon her by a myopic establishment. She simply acknowledged the stark reality of the bargain she had been forced to make. She looked back at the battleground of her youth and recognized that she had fought the best possible war under the worst possible circumstances. She had walked onto a set explicitly designed to humiliate her, and she had walked off it 11 years later with her dignity completely intact. The cost of preserving that dignity was a lifetime of severe typecasting. It was a career permanently frozen in amber. It was an identity forever tethered to a fictional military camp from a bygone era. In the twilight of her life, Loretta Swit looked directly at that heavy, complicated ledger. She carefully calculated the agonizing professional losses. She measured the roles she never got to play, the characters she never got to explore, and the artistic freedom she was permanently denied. She weighed all of this against the undeniable cultural triumph of her creation. She weighed it against the millions of women who watched Major Houlihan and saw for the first time a female character who demanded respect and refused to apologize for her authority. And with the quiet, unyielding grace that had defined her entire existence, she decided that the price, however extortionate, had been worth paying. Loretta Swit was one of the very few actors to endure all 11 seasons of the series. She outlasted the original male leads. She outlasted the writers who first tried to define her. She did not merely change the trajectory of a single character. She actively dismantled the accepted methodology of how female characters were constructed in American television comedy. Her life story remains a stark, uncompromising warning. It exposes a brutal paradox at the core of the entertainment industry. For a female actor to escape blatant objectification, she must wage a grueling internal war against the system. Yet if she fights that war too brilliantly, the system simply builds a new cage out of her victory. She becomes permanently trapped inside the very armor she forged to protect herself. When Swit passed away quietly in 2025, she left behind an industry that still struggles with the boundaries it places on women. Her departure was not a Hollywood tragedy, but the peaceful conclusion of a life fiercely guarded from public consumption. She was a woman who possessed the formidable talent to inhabit 1,000 different lives, but who ultimately sacrificed her own artistic freedom to ensure that one specific woman was treated with unyielding respect. In a culture relentlessly designed to reduce a woman to a simple, digestible joke, her legacy leaves us with a haunting final thought. When the world builds an entire stage specifically to mock you, what is the ultimate